welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of What If, I want to ask the question, what if the locals had 3 power? This video was suggested by a few of our viewers, and it has a simple premise. The average minion power of a 10 minion faction is 30. The average power of an individual minion is 3. The locals have 2. So if a faction has 10 of the same minion, making it a printed 3 would meet the average. So does this fix all of Innsmouth's problems? No. But is it a step in the right direction for this troublesome faction? Also no. That part may come as a surprise to many viewers, but I will hopefully make the case in this video. First, I'd like to start with a thinly veiled comment. I have studied Innsmouth extensively over the years, especially recently, and I expect that many viewers will be misinterpreting this comment. In order to understand Innsmouth, we have to ask a few key questions. What are they, and what happened? Is Innsmouth a primary faction or support? They have a few outstanding cards, but are those cards meant to service some other faction rather than themselves? This is tricky because they feel like a swarm faction, but it's swarm support, which is a bit odd. What exactly does Innsmouth bring to the table? I think there are 3 key things: guaranteed distribution plays, card draw, and a low profile. Let's look at each of these. The guaranteed distribution play was the key idea between Kaiju Innsmouth. The locals do not overwhelm you with minion quantity to take up your action plays like robots do, but their ability hopefully guarantees that you will always have a minion to play, never wasting part of your turn. The fact that the locals have no equity means you don't have to worry about saving one for later. Their card draw is counterintuitive. They only draw locals, but those are still cards in your hand, and cards you don't have to draw in Phase 4. They also have Mysteries of the Deep, which can draw 3 or 5 cards. But most importantly, it's their low profile that appeals to me. When you play a locals, you are only adding 2 power. That means you can pace yourself accordingly. It makes it harder to burst, but less prone to burst yourself, which was a unique trade-off at the time. Done properly, this can be very effective. So what happened? Many of the Innsmouth cards are just inexcusably bad. These are well documented, and changing the power of the locals doesn't really change that. It does make their spreading the word play better, even though it has its own limitations, as I've talked about before. They get a 9 power burst, which is serviceable, and 9 is better than 6. But the problem is, conceptually it makes all the other cards worse and take away the locals' best strength, the low footprint. Consider Mysteries of the Deep, a non-terminal action that is realistically a bad card because of Tech Center. Also realistically, you need 3 locals. That's only 6 power, which is not insignificant, but you can survive it from a power creep perspective. At 9 power, that's way too close for comfort. You are giving someone a very efficient first place finish when the locals have no before the base score specials. Consider it also from the Deep One's perspective. For the Deep Ones to be effective, you need to have enough locals to make it worth it, and Innsmouth only has 1 action. That means if you plan to play the Deep Ones terminally, you need to use your extra plays in the locals, and with higher power per local, you have more power laying around for your opponents. Your 4 extra minion card plays would get slightly better at the cost of other cards. From a logistical perspective, certain cards would have to obviously change. The Deep Ones needs a new power target, although it really shouldn't have a power cap at all. Even at printed power 2 or less, it's still worse than other comparable cards. In Plain Sight would have to go to 3 or less, which is still a bad protection card compared to others, but once you are past the mass destruction of power 2 minions, do they even need protection at all? I would say no, which frees up a card slot, which is important for a future point. As I explained before, the Deep Ones just doesn't work in this context and shouldn't be a double feature. Sacred Circle needs to be a double feature, even though it is weaker than another one, because it's so important to the Innsmouth strategy and lets them play on multiple bases simultaneously, ensuring a low profile on both so that you can burst on the one of your choice. But it's also really easy to run out of locals. By increasing the power of the locals, you may or may not reduce that risk. If you never get your card draw engine going, you may not see new acolytes, which gives you all of them back, and getting all of them back makes the local stronger. This would happen if you play less locals because bases break quicker due to power creep, or the fact that you can never play Mysteries of the Deep. You can make a legitimate case that new acolytes should be a double feature as well. But then which other double feature loses a copy? The answer is none of them. With a faction that provides consistency of minions, consistency of actions is also important. It can be jarring to see your one copy of an action get buried and know that you may not see it in that game. Of course, this is true even if your good cards were bottom decked without locals, but Innsmouth relies so much on having the right cards at the right time that having fewer card designs and more predictability would really benefit them. Making the locals Power 3 won't solve their key issues alone, but it can provide a context for how to solve their problems more cohesively. If they have greater innate power, you need the deep ones less, and you don't need in plain sight. This starts freeing up card slots for more double features, one that would better serve them in the long run. To highlight this, we actually have a means to see the impact of 3-power locals, Dagon. While Dagon can do more than that, realistically, Dagon makes all locals 3-power on its base, which is what you want anyway, rather than global power because you want the local power. The only exception is that Dagon keeps the power for himself rather than the minion, which isn't a trivial difference, but this is about approximating effects. It's possible to play Dagon on turn 1, but why would you? You are just trading bursts at that point and starting the base with 9 or more power. Dagon is a power activation card because you can play him at any time, and by using that low profile, you can wait to play catch up, activate the hidden power, and burst from there. Having the extra printed power is like bursting with Dagon on turn 1, and it's a ton of power creep. Still, it is desirable to get the locals to have more power to have less reliance on the deep ones, which is why I would make the locals 3 power, but in a different way. Give each locals a talent to gain 1 temporary power. This way, the locals still get all the benefits of being a power 2, they still get the upside of their card draw, they still get the penalty of their card draw, and they get to be a 3 when it matters most, and not before. And if you think this is too strong on the Homeworld or Great Wolf Spirit, examine which card is really at fault, and don't make those cards. This change is much more in line with my inescapable feeling that the locals are meant to be power activation, which is achieved through Swarm, not a Swarm faction with persistent power. I realize I may be contradicting myself here, but I often say that a faction needs to work with itself first because they are in 100% of their own games. But making the locals 3 printed power would take away some of their best partners right now. Hydra, Rockstars, and Killer Plants to name a few, and while you would want to make Innsmouth more consistent, you want to do so in a way that keeps their low footprint identity and allows for printed power synergy. And I really like that identity, it's why I gave them to Kaiju, and the rest is history. But to make them much more consistent, we need to strike at the competing interest between minion quantity, minion quality, and power creep, and printed power doesn't solve that, power activation does. Of course, this would be super early for a hybrid ability, but it's necessary. The cards are just too entangled together, and you can't play everything in a turn, so you need a better means of spreading around this responsibility, and it's an alternative to giving them extra actions. Of course, there are still balancing levers, like limiting the talent to not working on the turn you played it. You still have the Innsmouth being vulnerable, which is okay, because you have the chance to play many of them in the same turn and get more power bursts. It means you can spread wide rather than deep, no pun intended, which is how they should be played anyway, and it keeps some of the more difficult cards from becoming too impractical to play. I don't want to detract from my previous Innsmouth retrospective, the Gymsmith, but this is another approach to solving their issues. Printed power alone won't solve them, but it provides a framing context that might. The locals get to be like Dagon without free extra plays, and it keeps their emphasis on cards rather than titans, and that's a good thing. In fact, even if you ignored all my other suggestions and gave the locals just as talent, you still get the Innsmouth game plan, play minions early with a low footprint, use the deep ones to burst, and activate their talent to get further power. This change alone would get them very far in their development. Would you still like to see the locals with 3 power? How would you address their issues? Or are they fine the way they are with Dagon? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.